Welcome to the Tepper School of Business Multimedia Series. For more information on the Tepper School at Carnegie Mellon, please visit us at www.tepper.cmu.edu/multimedia. And now, here's your selected video.
Hi, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome all of our alumni and friends back to the Tepper School of Business. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Carol Hess-Abraham, and I'm part of our advancement team. Today I have the honor of introducing our speaker, Jay Apt. You know that at Carnegie Mellon we pride ourselves on the interdisciplinary nature of our programs, and nobody exemplifies that better than Dr. Apt. He's an MIT-trained physicist who's a tenured faculty member of a business school. Prior to coming to Carnegie Mellon in 2000, he was a NASA astronaut. He spent more than 847 hours in space on 5 space shuttle missions, performed 2 spacewalks. He's been to the Russian space station and is the recipient of the NASA's highest honor, the Distinguished Service Medal. Back here on Earth, Dr. Apt is Professor of Technology and Director of the Carnegie Mellon Electricity Industry Center. His teaching and research interests include economics, engineering and public policy, and engineering systems design. He's going to give a talk on wind and solar energy and has promised to leave lots of time at the end because I know you guys are going to have a lot of great questions. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jay Apt.
So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. With an introduction like that, I should tell you that I'm usually the only one in the audience who owes their life to solar power and fuel cells. That's what we had up there. And we started doing some research on wind, solar, and other renewable power here in the Electricity Industry Center, a decade or more ago. And what I want to do is to show you some results of the work that we've done here. We generally take a data-driven approach. This is the Tepper School after all, we're all quants. And the other thing that we do is take a look at the policy and how things actually happen in Washington. As I was telling Lou Hay just a little while ago, I spent a day and a half a couple of weeks ago with the staff of a couple of commissioners in the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission who had very preconceived notions, not good ones, about renewable energy, and some very odd notions about some other things as well. And so we try and give folks facts. The other reason that we do that is not just for the insiders who are making a living at this day to day, but also for the public. One of the things that I see when I talk to folks about energy, whether it's coal, renewables, antimatter power, you name it, is that there is a vast cultural difference depending on where you go. In the U.S., over the last few years, what we've seen is a bifurcation, that's no news to anybody who watches the evening news, of politics, and people tend to get on one side or the other side of issues. One of the things that happens in energy is that people characterize it by saying, okay, this is my attitude about, you name it, natural gas, fracking, or coal, or wind, or whatever it is. And you see a very different attitude among people who have been out and seen the actual energy sources or who have looked at some data. So I want to show you today some data. I'm not going to draw too very many conclusions. I'm going to give you facts so that you can draw some conclusions. Okay? So first, some background. We have a carbon dioxide issue on this particular planet. Okay? And how many of you do business internationally? Okay, right. The U.S. is an outlier. Whether you believe that anthropogenic sources of CO2 and other greenhouse gases are responsible for this issue or not, almost doesn't matter. If the public cares about it where you're doing business, that matters a lot. And so let me just kill the lights just a little bit here. Yeah, this is a slightly different room. There we go. Lights 2. Let's try that. All right. Oh, thanks. That's all right. It's doing it here. It's just slow this way. So if you look from 1950 till now, 2010 is the latest data I've plotted here, electric power as a percentage of total CO2 emissions has gone up, and it's a little more than 40% of total CO2 emissions in this country. Another reason to decarbonize electric power is we haven't done very well at the efficiency in terms of CO2 per kilowatt hour emitted from our electric power system. We've done a bit. Okay, it's gone down a little, but not that much in the last 20 years or so. Okay? So that's why we see state legislatures passing state renewable portfolio standards that require a particular amount of power to come from renewable energy sources in this country. We do not have a national renewable portfolio standard, but 30 states in this country have renewable portfolio standards that require up to 30% of electric power be generated by sources that are defined in very different ways as renewable. At the same time, we're seeing our electric power generation go up and up with little dips for recessions here and there. But in general, there are two phases of this graph. The first phase is from end of World War II up to 1973. It was growing exponentially at 7.75% per year. After that, it's been growing linearly. That's a tremendous qualitative difference. Had we stayed growing exponentially, we'd be at about 4 times the electric power use that we are at the moment. Now, it may be that we see a transition to electric vehicles, for example, or other issues that could cause a return to exponential growth. But at the moment, we're on a linear growth phase. And that's a very different qualitative measure than the exponential phase. And if you extrapolate even the linear phase out to 2030 or so, it's half again as big an electric power system as we have at the moment. And so the policy debates that are going on now are how to fill that 45% or so. What should you build? At the moment, we tend to view life through a soda straw and say, our electric power needs are the same this year, or maybe even a little less than they were last year, so we don't need to do anything. This graph tells you it's a bit different. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at what's happened over the years. This is again since 1950 to 2010. This growth is now broken down into fossil fuels, the blue, nuclear, the orange, and total renewable, the green. Okay. The first thing to note about this is that total renewables were not negligible back in 1950. Okay. They've grown and grown and grown. So 30% of our electricity is low carbon. Okay. That's an astonishingly high number if you ask the public or the FERC commissioner. I asked this question of these FERC staffers 2 weeks ago, and the numbers came back about 2% that they thought was low carbon. Okay. This is the breakdown of fossil fuels. We had a shutdown of oil use for electricity that happened after the first oil price shock and then after the second one as well. And it's really only in Puerto Rico and Hawaii and a little bit of Alaska that we use oil. Coal took all of the hit of the recession, okay, in electric power use, probably because we were not generating power on third shift for factories. And it's come back a little. And natural gas has grown continuously since its low in the 1980s. All right, so let me ask this group. What percentage of U.S. electricity is now generated by renewables, things that states count as renewable? Okay, and a couple of ringers, you can't. Oh, the ringers spoke up. Yeah. So that's what most people forget is the hydroelectric power. And they say a couple of percent. Actually, it's 10%. Okay. And the big player in renewables is the hydroelectric power here. Okay. This is 2010. Coal's down a little bit from this. Natural gas is up a little bit from this. Oil's unchanged. Nuclear is about the same. Here's a breakdown of the renewables. You know, the vast majority of it is hydroelectric power. Wind is now up to just under 3%. Solar de minimis, although gets a lot of publicity. Okay. Wood. Well, what's wood doing there? Okay. It turns out, although we do have a few wood-fired power plants in various places, mostly what that is a byproduct of the pulp and paper industry co-generating from the black liquor that they use to make pulp and paper. But it's a huge number, right, compared to some of the other renewables. Municipal solid waste and geothermal. I don't mean the kind of geothermal that you might go to Home Depot to talk about, which is heat pumps. Geothermal power like the geysers. Okay, where you drill down and so forth is there. So that's the breakdown of what renewable power looks like. Now, here is hydroelectric power. It grew as we added capacity. And then, what are these dips? One big one, one small one, about a decade. What are those? Water supply, yeah. Droughts. In this country, we get about one big drought and one small drought a decade. So, again, hydroelectric power is about 6% of all U.S. generation. We are used to managing that kind of variability. Right? We just need to understand it. The hydroelectric folks have had 100 years to understand that sort of variability. And so part of our research has been to understand the variability of solar and wind power. Okay? By the way, so here is the renewables adding on the other things, the wood and the municipal solid waste geothermal, and increasingly the wind. Okay? So, again, just to drive this point home, this is the market share of things that state renewable portfolio standards generally count as, quote, renewable over the years. I was born in 1949, here's 1950 till now, and steadily diluted by increasing demand, gone down. But here is the total of low carbon electric power, counting nuclear. Okay? And that's about the same as when I was born. Right? So if in this country, we get as serious as some countries like South Africa are about decarbonizing the electric power sector. We are not starting from zero. We're starting from a very high installed base of low carbon electric power in this country. All right, so let's talk about wind power. Lou, you own a bunch of these dots, okay? And here is the windy part of the U.S., but there's a lot of wind in the Allegheny Mountains along in here. Okay, and some along the lakes. This is Canada as well as the U.S. Wind power's growth has been very high indeed. Okay, and I don't have certified data for 2011, but it keeps going up like this. Land use can be benign. Okay, this is a farm not far from here, Mill Run, in Pennsylvania, and the farmer's making between $3,000 and $5,000 a year per turbine for rental on this. Farmer's pretty happy person. Or there are people who say, well, if a little weed killer is good, a lot must be a lot better. And although they need those round areas initially, they don't need them later. And there are places like this where the vegetation has grown back and at the same time allowed cranes to come in for maintenance. The land use issues for wind and for other renewables are, in my humble but correct opinion, harder to solve than the electric power engineering. But we've done a lot of work on the electric power engineering, and I'm completely convinced that you can get to fairly large penetrations of this variable renewable source, wind and also solar, by fairly large, I mean at least 10 times where we are at the moment. But the land use issues are going to dominate. We're already seeing that in Pennsylvania, we're seeing it off Cape Cod and so forth. And this is the acres per megawatt hour that various power sources use, counting surface mining for coal and the surface use for natural gas. This is from a published paper that I think underestimates slightly the photovoltaic, but it's about right. Hydroelectric, very large, and these are generally for large dams. What he didn't break out in this paper, this isn't our work, was the run-of-river hydro and the other small head hydro that has very little impact indeed. But on the other hand, if I wanted to power the Bruce Mansfield power plant, 2,360 megawatts just past the Pittsburgh airport with biomass, I'd need all of Pennsylvania west of the mountains, okay, to do that. Biomass co-firing is feasible at small scale. And in fact, we know very well a couple of power plants that have been completely converted to wood chips, but it takes a lot of land. Okay, so again, let me point out that the public reacts to failures, okay? And if we say, look, stuff happens, it happens with natural gas, it happens with coal plants, and it happens with wind, then people get used to it. Stuff happens in a plant like this. This happens to be in the Netherlands, and there was a twin failure. Both brakes on this failed. If we deny that there are any problems, and there are advocates out there, I have good friends at places like the Sierra Club that say no renewables have any problems at all. Okay? We're going to run into a public backlash. If we say, you know, look, these failures are things that occur, they don't hurt. I'm not aware, Lou, are you of anybody who's ever been hurt by a turbine failure? I'm not. But if you get on YouTube and you Google wind turbine failure, you'll see some videos. One of the things that we try and do is tell people, look, these things happen, and there are ways that you can deal with it one way or the other. There are states like Vermont that require owners to put aside money for decommissioning old wind farms. We think that's not required. We just published a paper, it was a long legal analysis of what the precedents were, and then an economic analysis, and showed that the decommissioning costs are in general recoverable by the scrap value of the steel. Just the steel, not even the copper in there. And so we have said, we didn't start this with a preconceived notion, but we came to understand that there was no particular reason why states needed decommissioning funds. Unlike, for example, requirements that states have to have a fund to cap natural gas wells. Okay? The state of Pennsylvania was left with a huge bill the last time that we had drilling in this state. And I think we're going to be left with a bill again for the natural gas capping. Okay? But I don't think that's the case with wind. All right, so let me talk a little bit about where the wind is. It turns out wind and people are anti-correlated. Right? Because what? People aren't stupid enough to live where it's windy all the time. Okay. So you can do a couple of things. One is that you can build transmission lines from where the wind is to where the people are. Transmission lines take a while to build. This is some data that we looked at not too very long ago, a PhD student here, of all the transmission lines that were announced or built in the US over 50 miles, and this is a histogram of the time to construct them. Now that's not true in some localities. In single state jurisdictions like Texas, you can get them done somewhat faster, but it still takes a while. And so what we're coming to understand is that it is often better business and better policy to build the wind nearer load, even though it's not quite as windy. And the manufacturers are now building turbines that are designed to operate in less windy regimes with much higher efficiency. And so we're seeing local wind developers like Everpower Wind Holdings here and so forth build closer to load and access the transmission grid without these kind of delays. All right, so what about the variability of wind? Okay, this is all of Texas last year, and this was the wind that was installed in Texas, almost 10,000 megawatts of wind, and this is the output power of the wind. It falls off late in the summer, and it's quite variable. This is hourly output data. Remember, the grid operators are well used to working with variability in hydropower. Okay? And even the day-to-day, intraday power. But this is what it looks like. There are other issues. This is the load, the use of electric power in Texas averaged over the year, and it's a minimum of about 4 or 5 in the morning, and it's a maximum around dinner time, 1800 or so. And this is when the wind blows in Texas. Okay? That doesn't mean that you can't use a lot of wind, right? We have now some very good prospects for energy storage. A CMU company is now building a $100 million factory out in the old Sony plant in Westmoreland, Aquion Energy, and believes that they can produce utility scale batteries at $150 a kilowatt hour with 200,000 cycles. That solves a problem like this. Okay? And there are other ways to solve this kind of problems too. And if you are at 10 times the amount of wind that we have now, 30% wind instead of 3% wind, you can still deal with this just fine. Okay? But there are seasonal issues as well. This is the monthly average load in Texas, and this is the wind. The wind blows most strongly in the late winter and spring, not so much in the summer where the air conditioning is, and then it picks up again in the fall. Storage for things like this is probably impractical. And what that means is that we should develop policies that, if we get wind at quite large scale, have the effect of incentivizing other generators to stay online, even though their energy payments are getting undercut by those to wind. And we've developed some qualitative work that shows how that can be done at reasonable cost. And that's having some effect in some state legislatures. All right, so there are some other issues. This is Bonneville Power's area up in the Pacific Northwest of the U.S. And this is January of 2009, where the wind failed for a couple of weeks about. Okay? And so you just have to understand that there are certain areas where that happens. Okay? Bonneville is fortunate because they have a lot of hydroelectric power that they can bring online when this occurs. But again, if you're aware of this, then you don't have somebody saying, oh, look at that. We have to shut down all subsidies for wind or all incentive payments for anything that's variable like that. Stuff like this happens. It happens to hydroelectric power. We take nuclear power plants offline, so forth. We just have to learn how to deal with it. It's part of getting a mature technology. All right, so now let me talk to the quants in the room. I'm going to do some math here. There won't be any equations. This is wind power at very high resolution for a couple of weeks. Okay? So if you ask what that looks like, you can ask, is that white noise? If you played that through speakers, would it have the character of treble notes, bass notes, or somewhere in between? Okay, so we ask the question, and just like your iPad or iThingy of some sort has an equalizer on it, it's got bass notes at one side and treble notes at the other side. If you ask that same question of wind power, you see the same kind of thing. You see that the bass notes dominate. This is a logarithmic scale. And so at very high times, 30 seconds in this case, there is much less power in the fluctuations of wind than there is at large times. The fact that the bass notes dominate as opposed to the treble notes has an extremely important economic implication. People, before we did this sort of work, even after there was wind integration at a few percent in Europe, had said, oh, we're going to need tremendous fast ramping sources, very fast natural gas, even batteries, in order to integrate wind. No, because the very fast fluctuations are almost a factor of 1,000 less amplitude than the slow oscillations, you need very little of that stuff. You can buffer wind's variability just fine with pretty slow ramping sources. We buffered in certain locations in this country with coal plants, certainly with natural gas combined cycle plants and natural gas combustion turbines as well. Okay? Now, one of the other things that has dominated some of this discussion is how much money we have to spend on transmission lines to connect wind power together in order to smooth this variability. There are people like a group at Stanford University and some others that have had cover stories in Scientific American that says you will have to cover the country with copper in order to connect all of the wind plants together and get it all smooth. Okay? Otherwise, you won't be able to afford to integrate wind power. So we started to look at that. We looked at the 20 largest wind plants in Texas. Some of those lose, I think. And we said, well, what happens if you connect those together? Well, remember the power spectrum. This is the power spectrum of one of those plants, 24 hours out here and a few minutes in here. falls off like this. If you connect 4 of them, this is what you get. If you connect 20 of them, this is what you get. What you see is that there's virtually no difference at long times, 6, 12, 24 hours. You get smoothing, about a factor of 10 smoothing, at times like a minute, 15 seconds, an hour even, you get some smoothing. That has some interesting implications. First, as I said, the variability isn't white noise, and we talked about that. Second, when we talk about smoothing, it's really important to talk about the time scale. 12-hour smoothing is very different than 1 hour. And then third, and most important economically, the point of diminishing returns, first order condition, as you learned in your micro courses, is very quickly reached. And this is what that looks like. This is the smoothing as you connect these 20 wind plants together in various orders for 12 hours. And you smooth about half of the 12-hour fluctuations, and about a third of the 6-hour fluctuations, and about 95% of the 1-hour fluctuations. But in all cases, all you have to do is connect a half a dozen wind plants together and you're done. You do not need to cover the country with copper. And many of us who are in this business have heard this said, in order to reduce substantially the fluctuations of wind power. Okay, so I can't leave you with too many ideas, so I'll now move on to larger areas. So what happens if you connect the big wind areas in the country together? Does that make more smoothing than if you just connect these 20 wind plants in Texas together? Again, this is this kind of the slope of that smoothing, and this is for Bonneville Power in the Pacific Northwest, California, Texas, and the Midwest. And this is kind of the coefficient. This is sort of the average. If you connect them all together, it doesn't change very much. Again, you do not need to spend the money to connect the whole country together in order to smooth out wind's fluctuations. And again, there's some correlation coefficients. If you connect California and the Midwest together, you get some benefit, some negative correlation, but in general, not much benefit, okay, to doing that. You don't have to do that. There are some other ways to do that. It does help the big step changes that you need to have reserve plants online. And so we have done a calculation that says, look, is it more cost effective to keep a natural gas plant online to counter these occasional changes from hour to hour than to build transmission? And unless you can build transmission much more cheaply than we see it, about a factor of 10 more cheaply than we see transmission built, it is much more cost effective to put a small or a large even natural gas plant next to the load or next to the wind whose fluctuations you're trying to do. Okay? All right. So now let me talk about the cost of variability. I put this slide in because my acquaintances at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission staff were convinced that the costs of this variability were as large as the cost of the energy from it. So we did some work showing this is the capacity factor of the wind turbine. The better wind turbines are out here. The ones that are in not such windy places are in here. And the variability cost, this is in dollars per megawatt hour, divided by a factor of 10 to get cents per kilowatt hour. This was the highest cost year for countering variability in Texas. There were lots of reasons for that. And even in that year, the cost was a factor of 10 less than the energy cost. Okay? And in a more normal year, 2009, it was about a factor of 20 smaller than the energy cost. So yes, there's variability in wind. Get over it. Fine, you can counter that. Okay, fine. All right. So I've said hydroelectric power has droughts, right? And so one of the questions that we asked was, does wind power have droughts as well? Well, we don't know because we haven't had a lot of wind power for a long time, despite Lou's best efforts. Okay, we need about 30 or 40 years of data. What we do have 40 years of data for is airport data. So we selected airports in the great windy belt of the United States, okay? And the airport data isn't perfect. You have to scale it up using various mathematical techniques to the height of the hub of the wind turbines. You have to do some other mathematical shenanigans to it, but you can get close. And so what we did was, this is the kind of normalized hydroelectric power changes with time. And this is what we predicted the wind power would be if the wind was where the airports were. And yes, you do see windy years and not such windy years, but it looks to us as if the wind droughts are going to be kind of half the magnitude of the water droughts that we see. That's not an ironclad case, and we have to wait 40 years to get one, but we think that that's about what it is. Okay, so again, there will be windy years and not such windy years, but it's probably not going to be such a big deal. And let me show you, we may be seeing some evidence of that in Texas. The specialists call the percentage of the possible kilowatt hours that are generated by a power plant that are actually generated the capacity factor. Okay? And so in Texas, we see the capacity factor has varied over these years. If you like graphs, this is what it looks like. And it may be that this year was just one of those not quite such windy years. Okay? There may be other reasons as well. It have to do with transmission constraints and so forth, but we've tried to back that out in this data. So yeah, we're seeing some of that, but we think we can deal with it. All right, what about solar? All right. These are all the operating solar plants over 5 megawatts, including some of Lou's right there, and a bunch in New Jersey. Why? Why New Jersey? Anybody from New Jersey? All right, so why do we have a lot of solar in New Jersey? Policy, yeah, okay. Policy of a particular governor who was in a high-speed car crash a while back and got defeated, right? And I'm good friends with the woman who was the chair of his Public Utility Commission at the time. And it was a straight decision of New Jersey that had nothing to do with economics. I don't think Governor Corzine has ever met an economist. It makes a lot of sense down here, and it makes a lot of sense here. Here, not so much. Okay. Let me tell you some good things about solar. There are 4,000 times, more or less, more sunlight energy that falls on the United States than the electric power we use. Even at lousy efficiency, 7% efficiency, we would have much less of our land covered with solar cells than we use for crops. Actually, I say cropland, that's crops plus where we're grazing cattle. The capacity factor isn't wonderful. We've seen up to 23% sometimes. I did a calculation of the photovoltaic array on the Department of Energy headquarters. It's about 11%. Okay. And 15% for the U.S. Solar as a whole. What are you seeing in Florida, Lou? 15, 20%? Something? Yeah.
Around 20.
20, yeah. Okay, that's good. If you keep it where the afternoon clouds don't shade it, probably. Yeah. All right, the cost is the issue. The unsubsidized cost, and of course, lots of reasons why we do this are because there are market forces that are trumped by non-market forces. In Pennsylvania, it's about 32 cents a kilowatt hour unsubsidized. Over the U.S. as a whole, it's about 25 cents a kilowatt hour. There are huge subsidies that are available, so these things are not what a developer would see. The price of solar cells has been decreasing, but not as much as some people had thought a few years ago. And solar cells themselves only make up about half of the system price. People are working on the rest of the system, but it hasn't come down as fast as we thought it would. Okay, so let me now talk about some quantitative work on solar. We looked at what was, at the time we looked at it, the largest solar array in the country near Springerville, Arizona. This is what it looks like. And here is the solar output over a day. Nice cosine squared, you know, sun goes up, gets to be noon, sun goes down. The very next day, what happened? Clouds. Yeah, you notice the publicity picture that they have has clouds in it, right? Okay, so this is 1 minute data, and these are 10-second data here, okay? It is, again, variable. And fine, as long as we know about it, forewarned is forearmed, right? And so we're learning how to integrate that. This is 2 years of data from that plant. There's some really interesting stuff to physicists like me, right? Here is the nameplate capacity, and it actually produces above the nameplate capacity. What's happening? Anybody know? Even some of the ringers in the room know? I didn't. So, say again?
Cold day, but bright sun.
Cold day, but bright sun. Well, you're right about the bright sun. When we talked to the guy who did this, he says, oh my, that almost got me fired. We were blowing all the circuit protection until I figured out what it was. Turns out if you go outside on a day with some puffy cumulus clouds and look around the edge of the shadow of the cloud, it's bright. The cloud focuses the light, and that's what he was seeing there. Okay, so again, we're learning stuff all the time. All right, so what about solar thermal, where you put a working fluid? It's kind of like oil. It's not really oil. It's very expensive oil, much more expensive than even Middle East oil, right? You put it through a tube like this, and you focus the sun on it. We have done some work with the largest solar thermal array in the country and looked at some of the same kind of data. These are the same kind of power spectra you saw for wind, which is in the red here, and solar photovoltaic, which is more variable than wind at high frequencies. That is to say, you're going to need more resources to counter the variability of solar photovoltaic than for wind. And this is solar thermal. Just as you would expect, because you have a heavy fluid that has some inertia there, when you heat it up, it stays hot. Even if a cloud goes across the sun, it'll stay hot for a little while. And so the variability of this solar thermal is quite a bit less than even wind, and at least a factor of 10 less variable than for solar photovoltaic. The trouble is, at the moment, the solar thermal costs are higher than for photovoltaic, and they're going up. You know, we talk about learning curves. Learning by doing, everything's supposed to get cheaper after you do it. Sometimes, in fact, I should say almost all the time, for energy products, and I think for some others, it gets more expensive before it gets less. Why? Because the first ones don't work. We saw it with pollution control equipment. We saw it with LNG tankers. We're seeing it with solar thermal. And the coatings are flaking off, and those problems will get solved. But for right now, it's getting more expensive. It'll get cheaper after a while, assuming the problems are solved. And so we took a look at a comparison. This is one particular wind farm in Texas, solar thermal and solar photovoltaic. These are two photovoltaic ones. And this is the cost of variability. Again, divide by 10 to get cents per kilowatt hour. And it's about half for the wind and the solar thermal than it is for the photovoltaic. Okay, and again, sort of a maximum of 10% of the total energy cost for these, and maybe 20 or so for the others. But that's the kind of quantitative work that we're doing and think will be increasingly important as these variable and intermittent renewable sources get to be part of our energy system. And the smart integration is entirely feasible. It's going to require a portfolio of fill-in power. And some of that may be batteries, but some of it can be coal plants. It's a lot of the myths that have been generated over the years can get exploded by using actual data, so we do that. And again, the variability costs are small, and they can be mitigated by doing some interesting things. I haven't talked about some of our work that says if you put very small amount of batteries paired with wind farms, you can knock the highs and the lows off that power very quickly, and you can really reduce this. I didn't have time to get into that today. So that's it, and I've tried to leave a bunch of time for questions. Thank you very much. Right.
Can you talk about the viability and economics of individual wind generation for an individual house, say in combination with new batteries?
Oh, okay. Put wind on your house. I will first tell you about a test that was done in a windy area of the Netherlands, Zeeland, about 3 years ago. They took 12 commercially available small wind turbines of the type that you would put on your farm, you know, in Maryland or wherever, and they set them up and did a year's test. The first thing to know is that 9 of the 12 survived the year. 3 of the others didn't. The second thing to know is that the capacity factors varied widely on these. This was kind of a consumer's report test that is in the Netherlands. And the difference between what they told you the capacity factor was going to be and what it was eye-watering. And the amount of maintenance that some of these needed was pretty high. I haven't seen anything more recent than that one 3 years ago, but they sure weren't ready for prime time at that point. Some people may know others. You deal with big ones.
Yeah, there's a lot of companies making little ones now, but I think they're still very costly.
Yeah, and I think not very reliable, actually. Yeah. Let's see, there's one more over here and then several over here. Go ahead.
Do these industries need some type of long-term trade policy to foster their development and their commercial success?
Okay, there's two different questions. Do they need some type of long-term policy, and do they need a trade policy? Okay, let me tell you a story about Germany that has a huge subsidy for solar. It's 50 euro cents per kilowatt hour, and they expected that would encourage German firms. It has encouraged Chinese firms. Right. And so most of the PV in Germany, which, by the way, Germany has about, even southern Germany, has about the same amount of sunlight that southern Alaska does. Those things have not worked out so well for them. In this country, I have some friends who are wind developers who say that they do not put in a wind development that cannot survive without the federal subsidy. Not all of them say that about the state renewable portfolio standards, right? We need some demand pull as well. I don't think that there are any solar developments that I'm aware of in the US that are viable for on-grid applications without a subsidy. That's not true in some places abroad. Kyocera just announced a 70 megawatt solar farm in Japan, which can bring in power at about 36 cents US a kilowatt hour. That turns out to be about what they pay for oil-fired power there. Now, it's 3 times what they pay for natural gas power, but they do still produce a fair amount of their power from oil. But in the US, I mean, somebody who knows this stuff, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that there are solar ones that could survive without subsidies. Policy. The trade policy is a very different issue, and it's a very interesting one. The US put a tremendous amount of R&D into wind power after the first Arab oil embargo. That mostly went to the big aerospace manufacturers. They made wind turbines that looked like airplane wings. They were disasters. Right? The technology that actually won out came in from the European boat building industry. We had a PhD student who actually tracked the technology that went into some of these, and it did not come from the big subsidized efforts either here or in Europe. Okay? It came from some small subsidized efforts in Europe. By the way, so here's a quiz. When was the first 1 megawatt scale wind turbine operating in the United States? Even the renters can bid on this one.
1890.
Say again, 1990?
1890.
1890. Okay, well, all right, that's a little earlier than I guessed. It was, but you're qualitatively right. It was actually 1941. It was a big riveted thing. It looked like a battleship. It was up in New Hampshire. So, okay, let's go over to this side. Yes, sir.
So you showed a growth rate of energy utilization of 45% or something like that.
Oh, no, just a growth, if it stays linear, about 45% more electricity, not energy.
Electricity. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, I meant to say electricity. But there's some people at DOE who say, well, because of the recession we've had, use is down now, and projections are for it to go lower. So how do you reconcile that? So
one of our former colleagues here on the faculty, Howard Grunspecht, is the #2 guy at the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and we have had some long talks over adult beverages. And so Howard is a very good quantitative guy, but EIA, as most folks inside the Beltway, are captured by short-term trends. And I think they are being too pessimistic about the use of electric power in the U.S.
So there's really two different opinions.
Yeah, I mean, that has some serious consequences, but the EIA has misforecasted prices in some very serious ways. A decade ago, when we had the last natural gas generation building boom, where we built 60,000 megawatts of natural gas in 1 year and about 40,000 in the next year, and drove the electric power use of natural gas up by about 10% of the total natural gas use, and gave us the price spikes. The EIA had forecasted essentially flat natural gas prices from now until the cows come home. There are general equilibrium models that might have been used. Okay. Yes, sir.
At the risk of getting you off topic, your years with NASA, what is your perspective for the space program?
Let's do that right after this. Let me get a few extra questions. I left NASA 15 years ago. They had offered me a 5th mission, and I left for reasons just like the premise of your question. Yes, sir.
I'm interested about the photovoltaic cells. How long will it take for this technology to evolve? Because I know it's going to, the present solar technology we have is still too expensive for the typical consumer to afford. How long will it take? Because we need to do 2 things, to break down the cost and advance the technology. How far off are we?
Okay. At the moment, we can generate power in good sites, utility scale power at about 25 cents a kilowatt hour. I don't know, I mean, I think you could probably generate wind power for 7 or 8 cents. That's unsubsidized. Lou, you have a different opinion?
Yeah, I
You have
think
numbers.
it's a little old now on solar. I have the exact same view as you on solar, that the costs really weren't coming down that fast. For the last 2 years now. Some of this is a
Yeah.
market dynamic going on, but it's also better performance of the cells. I just entered into several big contracts at 7 cents a kilowatt hour.
Oh, okay, but
Now that includes,
they took the investment tax credit for that, right?
That includes investment tax credit. But even if you gross it up for the investment tax credit,
15 cents?
probably a little less than
Little less. Well, that's a good thing.
13.5.
And what do you bring wind in for, unsubsidized? 7?
Well, I don't sell any unsubsidized.
Yeah, that's right.
But I'll tell you, I mean, you know, again, it's some of the data we were showing that we're now seeing 55% capacity factor.
Yeah, in certain areas we can see that, and especially at certain
And
times.
in those areas, we're selling it for well less than 3 cents.
Yeah. And, well, and you're taking the production tax credit at 2.2 cents.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's still 5.5 or something, which
But you
is
can't,
pretty good.
nuclear's twice that.
Nuclear is at least
Coal
twice that.
plants, probably close
You
to twice
bet.
that.
For low carbon power, I think what the numbers that you've heard is that wind is probably the best performing economically low carbon power. Nuclear is probably next, and solar is probably 3rd. I'd rank them that way. Yes, sir.
I guess speaking of solar, still, the trend, the beginning of companies we're seeing, they're doing solar leasing. Are you familiar with the solar leasing trend? And is that, I mean, are they just blowing smoke, or are they, I mean, what's?
No, they are utilizing the tax benefits in a very good way, right? Mm-hmm. And so the difficulty that we've seen with solar leasing companies is the liability on the rooftops, right? And so it's, again, they're taking very nice technical work to take the subsidies and do the right thing. But they've also got the technical work to do on the back end, which is that it's their liability on my factory's roof, right? Or my house's roof. Exactly. That's a different story. Individual rather than utility scale solar is still pretty expensive. As Lou said, the utility scale solar had come down. The last I saw was about $3,500 a kilowatt. But the last I saw for even a large-scale home installation was almost triple that. So the Million Solar Roofs initiative that Governor Schwarzenegger wanted is not getting to 1 million.
Does that tie into Germany, your comment about Germany's dissatisfaction with their experiment, or with what's going on with their policy?
Chancellor Merkel is trying very hard to reduce or eliminate the 50 euro cents per kilowatt hour solar feed-in tariff, as they call it over there. Because the Greens parties are integral parts of her government, she's catching a little flack. In Japan, they had a building integrated photovoltaic subsidy feed-in tariff for many years, and they determined that it was not changing the slope of the learning curve at all. And so they eliminated it.
You mentioned earlier in your talk about the importance of keeping certain, let's say, gas or other fossil plants online to deal with some of the fluctuations in the Texas market. Are you working on market design changes in market designs? I mean, the Texas market is very different than some of the other markets in terms of their design, and they seem to have a strong opposition to adopting some of the things that you see in other markets, like a capacity.
That's right. Well, heck, they had a strong opposition to going to a nodal market.
Right.
Yeah.
But are you doing work in that area to try to help places like Texas figure out a more effective market design?
There are certain stakeholders in Texas who don't think we're helping. But yes, we are trying to help.
Well, is the answer a capacity market or something like that?
What we decided to do, because we looked at it from a straight market design standpoint and said, and we ran into a buzzsaw. We decided to look at it from a data-driven standpoint and say, okay, what are the number of generators that you're actually going to need, given certain reliability standpoint, and given the forecast of wind. So let me talk for the non-specialists in the group. We don't care what the wind is doing. We care about the difference between the forecast value of wind and what the wind is actually producing. Okay? Because if you blow your forecast, then the grid operator is going to sweat. Okay? And so we've been looking at the forecast data and deciding from how often they mess up the forecast and how the improvement or not in that has been, what the ancillary services you're going to need are. And so then we're going to go back to ERCOT and say, okay, this is the picture in terms that your grid operators can understand. This is where we think it's evolving. This is what we think it could make it easier for you. And we think the buzzsaw may be turned off at that point, but we'll see. Yes, we're trying. Yes, sir.
Professor, one of your points on your concluding slide was that we should be taking a portfolio approach.
Yeah.
And you mentioned a bit in your talk about bundling batteries with wind or the renewables with coal and whatnot. I'm wondering, have you guys seen any research or activity around bundling the renewables together in a large scale? So wind with solar or wind
it's
with
interesting.
hydro and whatnot, to see how does that as a portfolio approach work?
We've just gotten some data of a wind plant and a solar plant that are near each other, and we're taking a quantitative look at that. There has been a lot of qualitative arm waving on that. I have seen a few bundled bids in some jurisdictions outside the U.S. I've heard of some in the U.S. I don't know, do you guys know of any bundled bids in the U.S.? But I've heard of bundled bids in Europe. At the moment, it's early days yet.
I think we have time for one more question. I apologize. We've got another group coming.
Okay. Well, we got to be out of here by 2, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, new one in.
Right.
My question is not about technology. From a policy point of view, for the existing solar farms or wind farms, how do you see the treat from the property tax point of view? Is that treated as more like unimproved land or manufacturing facility, or how do you see that changing in the future? I mean,
I will take the professor's foolproof answer and say, I have no idea. but Lou may, and my guess is it's very heterogeneous across the U.S. because property taxes, it's like the advertisement you see in the airline magazines. You don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. Right. So I suspect it's a lot like that. I don't know.
You pay a lot of taxes.
A lot of taxes. Thank you all very much.